Professor Freddie Boy, and ladies and gentlemen. I think most of you would have heard of the butterfly effect, and it is a term used in chaos theory to describe how small changes to a seemingly unrelated thing or condition can affect large, complex systems. And in a somewhat polemical way, it postulates that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could set off a tornado in Texas. Well, maybe it's what's causing the cold spell in the US, I don't know. But the hot, dry weather that we're experiencing in Singapore these days is already being attributed to the butterfly effect. Well, the butterfly effect, in my view, is a way of describing how large systems are impossible to model with any kind of accuracy because there are too many unknown variables to track. Events and actions in different parts interact with each other in complex ways to produce effects that are difficult to determine ex ante. Instead, their behavior is emergent. A good illustration of this is the turbulence of the 2008-2009 global economic and financial crisis that resulted from the collapse of the subprime mortgage sector in the United States. What started as poor lending decisions of a few imprudent financial institutions in the US led to large ripple effects around the world. A butterfly fluttering its wings in some remote corner of the world does not cause climate change. At least I do not think so. But climate change is certainly the effect of many linked events, decisions and actions around the world interacting with complex global weather systems. And eventually we do feel the effect of these interactions. Lenin wrote, "Everything is connected with everything else." And he might even have been aware, when he wrote this, that the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu had made much the same observation some 1,500 years ago, that everything is connected and everything relates to each other. Now, this is a fundamental insight into the world that we live in. The world is complex, meaning that there are countless agents interacting with each other in ways that are more often than not hidden from view, hidden connections, hence the title of today's conference. Now, their complex interactions lead to emergent behavior rather than to predictable outcomes. However, efforts to understand such complexities often rely on an assumption that what is complex can be reduced to simpler subsets that are easier to model, and then when re-aggregated will produce results that approximate the real world. A notorious example of this assumption that the world is not a complex system, merely complicated, in which cause is linked to effect in a Newtonian fashion, was the influential Club of Rome report. It was based on a mathematical model of world population that forecast the imminent collapse of civilization under the pressure of expanding population and shrinking resources, a Malthusian catastrophe of global proportions. The model was based on the work in control theory of a Dutch professor, Geert van Olster, and a Chinese mathematician, Song Qian, who was working on the control of missile trajectories, was so impressed by Olster's work that he convinced the leadership in Beijing of its validity, and this led to China's one-child policy. The rest, as they say, is history. Thomas Hobbes, one of the founders of modern political philosophy, argued that all phenomena, including human activity, could be reduced to bodies in motion and their interactions. Now, this assumption gave birth to modern science. It led to the tendency to dissect the world and to favor explanations framed at the lowest levels of scale, down to the atomic level, and even beyond, to subatomic levels, I guess to the Higgs boson, the God particle. Now, this approach is called reductionism. It is rooted in the belief that complex phenomena can be analyzed in its component and simpler parts. When the properties of these parts have been analyzed separately, It is then possible to understand the properties and behavior of the whole in terms of the properties and the interactions of the components. Reductionism has been central to the revolution in scientific thinking. But despite the enormous importance of this approach and its incalculable contributions to human progress, a critical shortcoming is that it diverts attention away from the complex interactions among the components of the system. And this gives a false impression that investigating the organizational features of things at a holistic level is less informative than investigating properties of the components. Indeed, outside the realm of science, reductionism has not been as effective in explaining phenomena in such areas as ecology and economics. For example, the economist Paul Ormerod wrote that in orthodox economic theory, the agents involved in any particular market are presumed to be able to both gather and process substantial amounts of information efficiently in order to form expectations on the likely costs and benefits associated with different courses of action, and to respond to incentives and disincentives in an appropriate manner. This is one thing. The one thing that these hypothetical individuals do not do is to allow their behavior to be influenced directly by the behavior of others, and that tastes and preferences are assumed to be fixed regardless of how others behave. What Ormerod is saying is that traditional economics does not take into account sufficiently the complexity of the real world. The foundational assumption that agents or people behave in a rational way and are not influenced by the behavior of other people or other agents does not help explain the effects of complexity in today's economic systems. Intuitively, we know that the contrary is true, that people are influenced by the behavior of others. The herd mentality that drives markets into bull or bear frenzies reflects this condition. In the real world, taking the terminology from complexity science, agents or people are not independent actors. They are interdependent, interacting and influencing each other in complex and emergent ways. However, it is only quite recently that the reductionist bias has been counterbalanced by efforts to study the overall properties of complex systems. The sciences of the 21st century have already begun to turn away from just focusing on micro properties. They are beginning to look at problems of complexity, acknowledging that the principles governing the properties of higher level entities are often quite distinct and unrelated to those of the components that constitute them. The Santa Fe Institute was a pioneer in this approach. Stephen Hawking said, and I think he said this in the last century, I think the next century, this is the 21st century, will be the century of complexity. New tools are needed to deal with this complexity. Conventional approaches to model complex systems, like the Club of Rome's model of economic and population growth, have often gotten it badly wrong. They use mathematical formula to link parts of a complex system together, wrongly or naively assuming that these parts interact with each other in a Newtonian fashion, with a clear link between cause and effect. Unfortunately, we now realize that complex systems defy such deterministic analytical models. Indeed, a real challenge is to discern when systems are complex and when they are merely complicated. Complexity science abjures reductionism for the study of how systems interact with systems, how agents interact with agents, and then how these lead to emergent rather than causal results. Complexity science tools include agent-based modeling, which examines how autonomous agents interact with one another and influence system behavior. These tools, applied to economics and to other areas like urban planning, provide fresh, usable insights that deterministic models have failed to produce. The organizational analog to this new emphasis on complexity science is interdisciplinary collaboration. It is a counter-reductionist approach in which the complexity of the problem is reflected in the complexity of the organization that is trying to resolve it. In research or in an academic setting, this approach means that silos should be collapsed in favor of interdisciplinary collaboration. Last month, and I think this was February, when launching 3 new undergraduate degrees, President Bertil Anderson said that NTU should continue to focus on science, engineering, and technology. But he also stressed, and I quote, "It cannot be technology alone. It has to be technology plus. The disciplines cannot be studied in silos. They are all interconnected, and it is at these disciplinary interstices that many of the new discoveries are being made and Nobel Prizes are won." But it's hard to counter the deep instinct in academia to focus on a single discipline, bred out of centuries of reductionism, and to instead move towards interdisciplinary collaboration. I suspect that the younger universities will be more open to this collaborative approach than the older universities, which are steeped in tradition and which have been organized in vertical silos for decades, if not for centuries. After all, there is a Nobel Prize for chemistry, for physics, for economics, for medicine, but none for complexity as yet. Nonetheless, interdisciplinary collaboration is imperative for solving the big challenges of today in science and technology, in the social sciences, in the economy, in urbanization, in the environment. For more than 30 years, the Santa Fe Institute has been at the vanguard of this quest to collaborate across traditional academic silos, and it brings together researchers from universities, government and industry, physics, economics, anthropology, to grapple with complex real-world problems. In Singapore, the emphasis on interdisciplinary studies is more recent, but NTU's commendable efforts to build a capability in complexity science are an acknowledgement that academic silos should be collapsed in favor of interdisciplinary collaboration. And it is not alone. The new Singapore University of Technology and Design emphasizes the design approach, bridging technology and creativity, science and art. And I see it as a major experiment in how universities should be organized in future. I think it deserves to succeed. The imperative for horizontal collaboration exists beyond academia. Some of the biggest challenges that governments face today involve the emergent outcomes of complexity. They include wicked problems such as climate change, population, urbanization. There are many stakeholders, but they have conflicting perspectives, different opinions, and divergent interests. Please one, and you upset the many others. Solve one problem, and another will arise. No single government agency is really equipped to deal with such wicked problems on its own. Professor Scott Page of the University of Michigan, who was in Singapore recently, I think in January, argues that diverse teams are better able to solve wicked problems because each person offers a different perspective, a different mental model, and therefore a different representation of the problem. The exploitation of diversity in government as part of the process of tackling wicked problems of complexity is analogous to breaking down academic silos in universities. And in Singapore, we call this the whole of government approach. However, the whole of government approach has to overcome the deeply ingrained bureaucratic instinct to operate within silos, rather than horizontally across silos. This is a big hurdle because it requires a fundamental change of mindset into a culture in which officers consider the spillover effects of what they do and their impact on the policies and plans of other agencies. This mindset also requires a willingness among agencies to work together to achieve common outcomes. Now, this mindset is so important to good governance in a complex operating environment that the whole of government approach is a priority of the top leadership in the Singapore Public Service. Today, there are interagency platforms that have been established to share information among ministries, statutory boards, and other agencies in order to take in different ideas and insights so that the wicked problems can be viewed in their manifold dimensions. Coordinating bodies now deal with cross-agency strategic issues like the National Climate Change Secretariat and the National Population and Talent Division. The logic of breaking down silos extends beyond government into working with citizens to jointly understand and solve problems. For example, the Urban Redevelopment Authorities recently launched an exhibition of its 2030 draft master plan in order to gather feedback from the public to help fine-tune plans for Singapore's urban development. And this exhibition attracted about 2,000 visitors daily and was organized with a website and iPads to obtain public feedback. Another example is our Singapore Conversation, which, as you know, was a year-long process involving more than 600 dialogue sessions and nearly 50,000 participants. And this process surfaced fresh insights for the government and indeed for the citizen participants, such as the desire for broader definitions of success or greater assurance about healthcare and retirement. And these are insights that would otherwise have been more difficult to obtain. The design approach is another way of dealing with complexity. It is not about fashion, I may say. The Singapore government is now experimenting with a design approach which puts its policy makers and planners into the shoes of the stakeholders in the people and the private sectors to gain better insights into the impact of policies and plans. The design approach in which we think from the view of end users, whether it is someone with disabilities or mother with triplets, will help us better design policies and their delivery to the customer. I would argue that it is conceptually not dissimilar to interdisciplinary collaboration, and would like to take this one step further and argue that its logic is rooted in complexity. Last year, a government administrative officer, Agnes Quek, chose the road less traveled, and instead of taking the conventional path of a postgraduate degree, she arranged instead for a one-year secondment to the world-famous design firm IDEO. Now with the Land Transport Authority, where the problems are undoubtedly complex and wicked, she will be part of the vanguard in government that will lead a new design approach to the development of public policy. Now, the establishment of the Complexity Institute today is an important milestone on the long road to interdisciplinary collaboration in NTU. I congratulate NTU for its conviction that the future is in complexity and for transforming a program into an institute. The NTU Complexity Institute has a strong affiliation with the motherlode of complexity science, the Santa Fe Institute, and the presence of several complexity luminaries here today reflects these connections. The road that NTU has taken towards interdisciplinary collaboration and the formation of the Institute parallels the evolution of thinking within the Singapore government, notably our push for a whole-of-government approach, collaboration with citizens, and design thinking. I hope that the Institute's research program will find resonance in the work of the Singapore government, and I hope that the Complexity Institute will have the ambition of helping to address the pressing challenges arising out of complexity that the nation, government, and society in Singapore face today. I wish the Complexity Institute every success, and I hope that all of you will give it strong support. Thank you.